Microsoft 365 Business Premium includes Defender for Business. Defender for Business is an enterprise-grade antivirus and EDR solution, EDR being endpoint detection and response. In this video, we'll look at how you can deploy Defender for Business using Intune. Then, we'll look at basic device policy, antivirus policies, firewall policy, and attack surface reduction rules. I'm at the Microsoft 365 admin portal, and we're going to start with Defender for Business. Our setup in this video assumes that we're doing the onboarding via Intune. So if I go down to security, that takes me to security.microsoft.com, and if I head into assets and then devices, it triggers the onboarding and setup for Defender for Business. Now, this can take a few minutes or a few hours depending on the size of your tenant. So we'll come back when we're ready to do the actual Defender setup. Okay, a little while later I've come back to the security portal and I'm ready to do the Defender for Business onboarding. Let's click Get Started. Now the first screen is talking about permissions. This is a small business and so I already have security admin assigned to my account, and so in this instance I'm going to click skip, but what I won't skip is where the notifications should go, so I'm going to use our shared mailbox that we've got, threat alerts at our domain name, and I only want incidents to go to that mailbox for now, and I can click send a test email just to see if that works. If I continue, it will then give me the different options about how I can onboard from Intune, but we're actually going to not use any of these and do the auto connector Intune method. I'm going to click submit and finish the setup. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is go into settings and endpoints and advanced features and make sure that all the settings here line up to make sure that our business is protected in the best way possible with this product at the license level we're at. So by default, this is what it looks like, and I'm only going to talk about the changes we need to make and some of the standout settings as well. So custom network indicators is useful one, because if we go into indicators and we start adding known bad file hashes or known bad URLs or IP addresses, if that setting's not on, then this doesn't get honoured. Continuing down the list, tamper protection obviously stops unwanted changes to Defender by potential malware or end users. Web content filtering, again, is very useful if you're making use of that function in Defender. So if we go to web content filtering and add a policy and called block new domains, as we know, phishing domains are often very new domains. You can go through and pick a category of newly registered domains and maybe park domains as well, and click next. And at business premium level, the only option you have is to scope to all devices. Click next and done, and you've just set a web content filtering policy. It was really that easy. Going back to advanced features, if you want to make sure that activity by your admin is audited, I would switch this on as well. And to make the onboarding super easy via Intune, you want to turn on the Intune connection. This will also share the data back to Intune to use for compliance policy, as we will discuss later. Click save, and that's that bit done. I just want to give some clarity on email notifications. If you happen to glance at this and notice that the email address we added earlier isn't showing, it's because it actually gets added in settings XDR email notifications, and by default you can see it sets any sort of low, medium or high incident you'll get notified on. So we've completed the steps we need to in the security portal. How do we get our devices to onboard? Well, if we head back to Intune, if we go back to endpoint security, we go to endpoint detection and response, and we create a policy. Click Windows, endpoint detection and response, and click create, and call it Defender onboarding, And what this will do is we want it to be an automatic from the connector, because the two portals are now linked, and by default we'll share the samples to help improve the Defender service. And you can assign this to all devices, and at the earliest possible opportunity all devices will onboard to Defender. To see where devices will onboard, we go back to the security portal, and then we go to Assets, Devices, and they'll show up here. One thing that Defender can do from the security portal is enforce configuration. If we go to Configuration Management and Device Configuration, we can see where the configs are actually coming from. And the way I prefer to do this is to use Intune to do the security policies, because it makes sense to me that all the endpoint config is done in one place. If you're not using Intune, there is a way that you can use the security portal itself to push security settings to the endpoint directly through the Defender agent, but we're not going to cover that in this video. Since we're using Intune to control our local device policy, we need to check our antivirus and firewall policies. If we start with firewall, this is the policy that will create and manage the Windows Defender firewall. If I select Windows and a Windows firewall, and of course you can come back here at any time to create necessary firewall rules for your business in the case of needing to allow a program or a web address or whatever it might be. But let's stick with firewall for now, and we give it a name. So as we know, on Windows there are 3 firewall profiles. You've got domain, private and public. We want the firewall to be enabled on all profiles, and there'll be some slight differences. Local policy merge is the setting that allows us to honour or ignore anything locally set on the machine. If we set this to false, it means that Intune becomes the source of truth for your firewall rules. You may want to consider this in a higher security environment, but for now, on domain, we're going to allow this to be true. Our default inbound action will be to block, and the default outbound action will be to allow. So in this case, if the device is the one making the call out to the application or service or network, it can communicate and do what it needs to. But what that doesn't allow is something on the external to actively try and talk to that device, which could be a security risk. I'll replicate this for private, so setting this to true for the actual firewall on that profile. Policy merge, true. Default, outbound, allow. Inbound, block. And then we do the same for public, so we're turning that on. But this time, I'm not going to allow policy merge, because this tends to be the riskier network. And as you can see, in brackets, the default is listed. Again, we're using Intune to enforce our defaults. At the bottom, we've got auditing. I'm just going to audit the failures so that the log size doesn't get too big. I'll click next and save. Now we'll take a look at antivirus. Now you might be thinking, I've set my security portal, I've linked the security portal back to Intune, and I've started onboarding devices with the onboarding profile. Are my devices protected? The short answer is yes, but in order for us to make sure that the endpoint is making full capability of the product, we need to ensure that some defaults are honoured and respected and set properly on the endpoint. Let's take a look at a policy, and I'll talk through some of the key defaults that should be set when you're using Defender. The way that you would create this policy from scratch is by clicking Create Policy, Windows, and then Defender Antivirus. In this example, I'll open a pre-created policy, but feel free to pause the screen and copy for your own environment, being sure that you actually test before you roll out to all machines. I've used this default across hundreds of machines, maybe even thousands, without really any issues. So what we can see here is that we're telling Defender what it can and cannot scan. So we're allowing archive scanning, behavior monitoring, email scanning, cloud protection. You can see these are defaults. But as mentioned earlier, we want to enforce the defaults in case something else, like a different AV or a different agent on the device, has changed them. We can't always start with a fresh machine. Real-time monitoring, again, pretty crucial one. Making sure that's on. CPU load factor at 50 to minimize disruption if your users don't have super high powerful machines. Cloud block level high is the default that I would recommend. You may get more false positives as you go higher than that, but from my experience, I've not seen too much on high. And crucially, network protection needs to be enabled. And if we open up the information tip here, this one tells you that it's needed to prevent people accessing things like phishing scams and exploit hosting sites through browsers. If you're using Microsoft Edge, it will try and use the Smart Screen service, but if you're using other browsers, then it will make use of the network protection feature and try and drop it at the network level. There's also some controls in here for potentially unwanted apps. This can sometimes present you with false positives, but you can look at that in the security portal. And then we can also set our scan times, days, and what type of scan to run as well. So at the moment it's set as quick scan. You can also choose how often Defender gets new signatures, and then the action it should take when a threat is found. And I'll scroll all the way down to the bottom here, just so you can see the whole selection of settings. And then you can just go next and save. Next, we'll look at attack surface reduction rules. ASR rules are a collection of behaviourally defined actions which common attacks may try to exploit. For example, some malware may try to spawn additional processes when a PDF is being viewed in Adobe Reader. The ASR rule block Adobe Reader from creating child processes attempts to prevent this from happening. So we'll start on the Intune portal, and Intune is the only deployment method that supports per raw exclusions, and we'll cover that later. And we'll go to endpoint security and attack surface reduction, and we can see there's already a policy there. Now I'll explain why this is here. It's in audit mode, so what we've done is start with every single rule in audit mode. Now before you do any further work with ASR rules, it's recommended that you put all of the rules in audit mode and then review the reports. The reason you do this is because you don't want to block legitimate business actions by using these rules. Let me show you what that looks like in the security portal. As part of implementing ASR rules, you'll want to go and check the reports. You can get those at the Microsoft security portal. If we go to reports and then ASR rules, you can see over the time the rules that have been blocked or audited and when exactly it happened. It's also important to note the rule name as well. The block credential stealing one is actually quite a noisy rule and produces quite a few false positives. But if this was the block Office apps creating child processes rule, then you might want to check that one out and see if it's a legit block. So in this example, we've got svc host.exe, and if we click on it, we get a little bit more information. But the real useful stuff comes from when you go to add exclusions. And then if it's a big list, you can tick the box at the top and then get selected exclusion paths. Now, just like Defender exclusions, it will give you the full path of the exe on the system that you need to put into your per raw exclusions back in the ASR rule bit of Intune. It's very important that you start with your rules in audit mode, because getting ASR rules wrong could be catastrophic for your business. So, let's say we've got our exclusion path for our Office app to create child processes, and it's a legit line of business app. How do I go about implementing that? Well, first of all, we would need to go into the rule that we created earlier, or the policy, and set not configured to this particular rule. And we do this so that there's no conflict in the rule in just a bit. And then I'm going to create another policy give it a name. Find our particular rule, set to block, and then I'm going to add my path. And I'm sure you've got a more official looking path than I have than that one, but you get the idea. And then you would assign this to the devices that you want to scope it to. You might put the exclusion in just for the finance department who use this one app. The idea of attack surface reduction rules is to reduce your attack surface, as obvious as that sounds, but if you can also do that at a department level, you're also winning as well. These are additions to your security strategy in your business, and they're the sorts of things that prevent Defender having to get involved by the point of something actually compromising your system. And then you can hit apply. Apply this for each rule after viewing your reports, and then you've done ASR very well. You can check the status of this as well in the security portal because it's all reviewed by SecureScore. Hard disk encryption has become a standard ask for many businesses and regulators to safeguard data in the event a device is lost, stolen, or inappropriately decommissioned. BitLocker is a Windows security feature that provides encryption for entire volumes, which can be deployed and managed using Intune. To get started with BitLocker, we are in the Intune portal and we've gone to Endpoint Security and Disk Encryption. Today we're going to focus on the most common ask, which is OS disk encryption. And if we click on the policy I made earlier, I'll talk you through why some of the decisions have been made in the settings. If I click Edit, this is the same view you would get if you made the policy from scratch. And let's talk about some of these settings. So, first and foremost, we want to require disk encryption, and then we want to disallow the warning for other disk encryption. The reason we do this is basically to prevent prompts to the end user and make this process as silent as possible. And we want to allow standard user encryption, so that means a non-admin user can do the encryption, and this is required for autopilot to function correctly. If you don't have this set and the device goes for autopilot, the device will not be BitLocker encrypted. We want the password to rotate if it's Azure ID joined or Entra ID joined. On to the next section. I've enabled the option to specify what the cipher strength is, and I've upped it from the default to 256-bit on all of the other types, even if we're not configuring them in this policy. I've just done it anyway. And then for the OS drives, I've enabled the enforcement of encryption, selected full encryption rather than used space only. And then we are requiring additional authentication at startup by means of TPM. Now, the job of a TPM is to ensure that a device has not been tampered with while it's offline. If it has, then it will prompt you for the decryption key. There are certain businesses or regulations or sectors that may want you to also use a startup key, which is something physical you have to plug in, or a PIN, which is something you have to remember on the keypad and put in every time you launch the machine. I think there are very few cases where that is necessary. For most people, this is good enough and does fit the bill of encrypting the device. We don't want users to change the PIN or password. And for recovery options, we want to allow the 48-digit recovery password if needed. And we don't want to enable BitLocker until the key is stored somewhere that we can retrieve it. And then a few options at the bottom here just to make the out-of-box experience quicker. And then that's us. You can apply that to all devices or the groups that make sense for your business. Typically, for most small, medium business customers, this is one of those policies that does go to all devices. Once a device is encrypted using BitLocker, I can go back to Intune, locate the device, and then go to recovery keys. I will then see the BitLocker key ID, and I can click show recovery key to retrieve the key. So, you've got your devices enrolled into Intune and protected by Defend for Business, but how do we further extend the protection of business data? We can use Intune Compliance. Compliance policies allow us to do a few main things, and I'll explain the benefits as we go through and create a basic policy here. if I create one for Windows, and this is one of the things that can actually extend to different operating systems as well, I'll call it Windows. And as somebody who works in the IT department, I might want to act on things if they're not as they are expected. So if BitLocker is not enabled, I want to know about it. Same with Secure Boot. And we'll look at some of the other options here, and I'll kind of talk through them. Minimum OS version if your business has very strict patching windows. We're not using Configuration Manager on this example. We can set password requirements, encryption as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be BitLocker, that's why that exists. Firewall, TPM, antivirus, anti-spyware, and Defender as well. So that needs to require. So if any of these are out or not as expected, the whole compliance policy for the device will fail. So the device will be marked as not compliant if a single one of these things is not as expected. We can also take signals from Defender for Endpoint if the portals are linked and get a machine risk score as well. So if the machine is high, we can mark it as non-compliant. This is particularly useful in high security environments, but may be problematic if you tie your compliance policies into conditional access policies, which I will talk about in just a second. I'm not going to configure that in this example, but I will talk about it. So, what happens when one of those things isn't met? I can mark it as non-compliant. That is the signal to IT that they need to go and fix the compliance problem. And you can leave this in the portal and expect the IT department to see it in the portal, or you can get it to send an email to the end user, and you can select a predefined message template and get it to email IT as well. Or you can add device to retire list. That's a bit harsh, a bit strict. Not seen that used in any environment I've done any work on. So in this example, I'm going to rely on the portal to do the work, and I need to see the portal to see it. And I'm going to apply this to all devices. Once I click create, I just wait for that to apply. And compliance evaluation is not instant. It can take as long as it takes for the device to check in, and then you'll get some stats soon appearing in the portal, and you'll see why the device is not compliant. It's a good way of spotting if the default antivirus is not the one you expected, especially in small business where the way that laptops are sourced are not always through the most ideal channels, and this can kind of flag up issues there as well. One more default to check on your tenant before you get started with compliance policies is what the compliance settings are set under compliance settings, because in this tenant, which is brand new, it says mark devices with no compliance policy as compliant. I would recommend turning that switch the other way, and that's only safe to do so if you don't have conditional access tied to the device compliance. That way you've then got a goal of getting every device covered by a compliance policy and then fixing the ones that flag up once you've set them. I want to take a side note here and just talk about the device compliance and linking that to conditional access. Now, I'm in the End Reporter now, and I'll show you what that means. So if I go to protection and then conditional access and then create new policy, let's call it Windows compliance. And what we're going to do is select, in this case we're going to go all users, but you really need to consider this one because it can be quite disruptive if you're not ready for it. Target resources, all cloud apps, or all resources as it's now called, under the condition that they come from a Windows device. They get granted access if the device is marked as compliant. So that means the device has to be Intune joined, and compliant. Now, the compliance is the bit that you choose. You can make that as lax or as strict as you want. But what that means is people can't sign into their work content from their home machine because that's not joined, or hopefully it's not joined to your Intune as a corporate managed device. But the bigger benefit is that if a user falls victim to a phishing scam and the credentials are handed off to an attacker, that attacker cannot sign in to their compromised account from their unmanaged device, which is likely not in the same country that your user is in. So this is actually one of the strongest controls you can put in on a business, but there is a bit of impact because it does change working habits and styles. But I really, really rate it, and it's one of the best things that you can do in conditional access. I'm not going to save that here, but just to show you the example of how you use it, that's how you do it. In this bit of the video, I want to talk to you about how capable Microsoft Intune is at deploying device policy and setting configuration profiles to give your device a security and customization baseline that is right for your business. We've so far spent a lot of time in the Endpoint Security Blade, and that is also where I would start with making policy. As a general rule of thumb, if you can see it in Endpoint Security, that's where you should make the policy. You can do it in Settings Catalog, which I'll show you in a minute, but it's easier to manage the core fundamental security tasks in this bit, and then do the sort of less important background configurations in Settings Catalog. That's my personal take on it. If you're new to Intune and you know you need to just improve the secure score for your device, and you just need to make that happen quickly, and you trust Microsoft to kind of help you out with that, you can use the security baselines. You should consider the baselines carefully. They're not designed to be all deployed at once, but if we look at the security baseline for Windows 10 and click Create, we can see that what Microsoft have done here is essentially take settings that are available from across Intune and condense them into one easy list that you could just click next, apply in your business. I don't recommend that is the way you go straight to production with it, but it is an easier route to get security in your business. If you're starting from nothing and you don't have in-house Intune expertise, this is a way to get started on that journey. There's a lot of settings in here, so you do need to consider them, especially if you've got line of business apps that need custom firewall rules, or that might get blocked by Smart Screen, or you've got developers that might get annoyed that they can't bypass Defender Smart Screen for downloading scripts that are relevant to their job. So you really do have to look at this, and you don't necessarily have to understand everything. I think that's unrealistic, but you need to test it in real life and see if anything breaks before you proceed to do it for all your users. I'll click next on this. I'm not going to assign this actually. I'm going to back out of this and show you another way. But you can definitely get started with that, and that is a way to improve the security on your endpoints. The other way of doing it would be more familiar to those who have come from a group policy environment. And if that's you, then I suggest that your first step is to reevaluate what group policy actually needs to do on your endpoints. I would wager that 5 to 10%, or maybe even more of your policies, are completely unknown in their function, are there because somebody put them in 3 jobs before you and no one's ever questioned it. And this is your perfect chance to question it and say, when we buy a new laptop, what does it need to have on it to be ready to work? Which apps does it need? Which policies does it need? How can we get going? There are tools in Intune to help you with this. You can use Group Policy Analytics, and you can actually import your group policy, and this tool will kind of help you understand how much of your group policy can be directly imported into Intune. I personally don't recommend doing this because I really think you should take this as a fresh start. But it was mainly put in to help large enterprises move to Intune more quickly, and it's done a pretty good job of doing that so far. So, okay, I've told you not to use this, and I've told you to reconsider, but how do you get started with that? You go to configuration, and I've told you that the priority of policy first of all is endpoint security. So if you see it here, configure it here first. If it's not there, we're going to go to devices, configuration. The second priority is settings catalog. So we set Windows 10, set settings catalog, and click create. Now this will look very familiar to you. If I just say that I want to disable autoplay, for example, this view might look familiar to a server you might have been on for a little while, where you can select all the policies that you're used to and even search them. Select the component, select the setting. If it doesn't say user, it means it's designed to be targeted to a device. Select the desired config, and then go through and assign the policy. Now, you notice what I did there is I gave the policy a name, I added the settings, I added the assignments, and I click create. Looks pretty familiar, right? That's the process we want to take with this. I'm going to fast forward to show you what this could look like if you go down the whole granular custom route versus using the security baselines. Either way is fine. The business outcome is we are securing devices. There are just two different routes of doing it. A little while later, this is what your policies could look like. What we have here is a well-considered list of policies that protect the device. They're well named and they're easy to understand. And the naming convention is Windows. Second bit is where the policies come from. So this whole pack of policies is actually a community-made baseline called the Open Intune baseline, and it's available for free, and you can Google it or Bing it and then download and import to your tenant. But this is a nice way to get started. If you're used to just having a policy pack and you want to get going, you can import these policies, assign them one by one, start testing, and you've got an easy, granular way of going in to see what each setting is doing, and you can make changes as necessary. The reason I like using this, and many other of my Intune friends like using this, is because if there's something wrong or there's a conflict, the way that it's displayed in the user interface is much easier for us to troubleshoot. So if there's a conflict on these bits here, I can click into time zone and I can see it straight away here, whereas the conflicts in the endpoint security baselines are a little bit harder to troubleshoot. But if you don't have anything else in your environment and it's simple, this shouldn't present an issue to you. So what is Microsoft Secure Score? Secure Score is a automatically calculated representation of your organization's security posture. The recommendations are made by Microsoft, and if you meet more of the recommendations, the score goes up, and in theory, the chance of your breach goes down. It's broken down into 4 categories: identity, data, device, and apps. And the number of points achievable is dependent on the licensing you have active in your tenant. On the right, you can see the comparison between your organization and some of a similar size based, I think, on user count. And that can be useful to kind of give you some motivation to get better if you fall far below what the average might be for your size. And it kind of proves that it is achievable to increase that score based on your business. Now, if we look at the recommended actions, I can filter this to device, as that's what we're focusing on. And you can take this as a to-do list, and you can remediate these things using Intune. But as I say, these are recommendations and they may not be fit for your business. So it's up to you to take a look at them and decide for yourself. If you click into one, you can see the status of it. This one is to address. Determines whether autoplay is enabled on the device. A brief description of what it is, and then how you might go about implementing the recommendation. Let's see what the options are for the status. Let's assume that we're using a different antivirus product at the time, and we don't want to be penalised for these points. We want to give some justification for it. We can go and manage that, and we can put the exception in place. So let's say it's a global exception. We have a third-party control. You can add your reasoning in here, in the text box, and you can set an expiry date. So if you know that in 6 months' time you'll all be using Defender for Endpoint, the status will be reset and it will be reevaluated, and you can come back here and update the control.